Jeremy Carl, the man, the myth, the legend. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing great, Peter. It's a pleasure to talk.
Yeah, excellent. So let's just, for those of the viewers who are not familiar with you, you're a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, and you focus on nationalism, immigration, and technology with a varied career in public policy, technology, and authorship. And we were just talking about you were work with George Shultz and a bunch of interesting people. But I want to talk to you, among other things, about your new book. Tell us a little bit about your new book.
Sure. So the book is called The Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. And as you could imagine, it's a provocative subject. And so has drawn a lot of interest, which has been great because that means that people are reading it and buying it and having discussions about it. And that was, you don't write a book to not have people read it. So that's been that's been wonderful. But it's obviously a sensitive subject. And so it's a subject that I really tried to deal with in a very straightforward way. It's sort of a just the facts, ma'am type approach. And I mean, obviously, like any author, I have my own interpretation of those facts. But I think even in the first draft, but I think that the best thing that my editors did as I was going through this is any time that anything kind of got emotional or charged, the commentary just took it out. Because it's like the lawyers have a phrase, res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. And that's sort of my view of my thesis is it speaks for itself. And so I don't need to dress it up in a bunch of, verbiage that's just there to get people angry.
Cool. Okay, so let's do this. So I'll ask you what you mean by anti-white racism as a definition, and then I'm going to play the role of somebody who is a true believer in critical social justice. And now, is that okay?
It's fine with me.
Okay, so let's start by defining the term. What do you mean by anti-white racism?
Sure. So what I mean by that is racism, which I think people have a reasonably good understanding what that is, but directed against white people. So, that you're going to say that they're inherently, I mean, there's sort of a couple different versions. One is that you're kind of saying that they are inherently lesser in some way. Another might not be making inherent claims about the capabilities or characteristics of white people in and of themselves, but you're still discriminating against them. And that was actually something I thought about a little bit in titling the book is, did I want to use the word racism or discrimination? Racism is a little more provocative, obviously, and a little more all-encompassing. And I decided that even though there were some instances in where I thought you could say, well, maybe there's just discrimination, but not racism in this particular point, that racism was a better overarching category to use. So I used it.
Okay. So to just be completely clear with you, I do not believe anything I'm going to say. Because I'm sure this will be clipped out 1,000 times about okay, so let me push back on some of these things.
Sure.
From a particular ideological perspective. So what is wrong with, and it's going to seem like a silly question, but let's use it as a setup, but what is wrong with racism? What is the problem with that?
Well, it's interesting that you would say that because there are a number of folks, perhaps further to my right, who kind of are not even in love with the idea of me using the term racism because they think that somehow in doing that, you're saying distinguishing by race is bad in some way. And I guess ultimately I kind of am. Yes. I mean, I'm enough of a small L liberal in that context that I am kind of making that claim and that it is bad. So I think in looking at just sort of how that type of discrimination works, it's important to just call it out, no matter what group is the victim and what group is the perpetrator. And while we obviously have not always been an anti-white racist society, I kind of talk about it in the book. It's sort of like if you're living under Kim Jong-un, you don't talk about how oppressive the North Korean state is. It's only when you escape Kim Jong-un that you start talking about how oppressive it was to live in North Korea. In the same way, we're talking about anti-white racism now, and you can actually track this in like Google Ngram in terms of when people started talking about white supremacy and white privilege. It's when those things begin to actually die in society, starting 60 so years ago, that people begin to talk about it a lot more.
Okay, so the thing that you didn't use there, which is interesting, is the discussion of power, and that
Yeah.
it usually involves influence and control of, like, for example, resources, policies, practices, narratives at institutional levels. So power isn't just an individual's influence, but the capacity to shape society structure. So where does, if at all, does power come into your definition?
It absolutely does. I mean, there is a kind of colloquial definition of racism being prejudice plus power, and I'm
Correct.
not. I don't think that that's necessarily illegitimate, and I think it's fine to talk
Oh.
about the power dynamics in society. And I would argue that while certainly white people are not powerless in any way, and I'm not trying to suggest they are, and I'm not trying to suggest that somehow uh, life is miserable for the average white person because they're just oppressed on a daily basis, and they might as well be back as Jews in Nazi Germany or something like that. Um, I am suggesting there actually are powerful structures in society right now that are aligned against white people, both formally in terms of things like affirmative action or quotas or things like that, and then also informally in the way that the culture deals with white people. I talk about this a lot in my chapter on Hollywood and the way that white people are portrayed and how that's changed over the past 60 and 70 years. And so I think that it's absolutely fair game to talk about power dynamics, but the kind of fallacy is that somehow white people are holding all the power in 2024 America. I think that's just not true.
Okay, so excuse me. So let's do a deep dive on this. Reed, could you please pull up the racial stats for MIT's incoming freshmen? So thanks. Here it is. The self-reported ethnicity, the class of 2027 and the class of 2028. So if you look at this, American Indian Alaska Natives, 2% in 2027, 1% in 2028. Asian Americans, 40% in 2027, 47% in 2028. And again, we're talking about a very small, depending on how it's defined, 2% of the population, three tops. But again, depending on how it's defined. Black African American, it went from 15% to 5%. So it plummeted. And even then, it's highly suspect that that 5% would have gotten there. That's another conversation, but we'll just accept these numbers by fiat for the moment. Hispanic and Latino went from 16% to 11%. Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander 1% to 0%, and white Caucasians roughly the same, 38% to 37%. So okay, so the reason that I'm pulling this up is, isn't this indicative of how white people and Asians, unfortunately, there's no line for Ashkenazi Jews there. I think that would be rather shocking.
Yeah, I think it's very relevant. It would be good to pull it out, but what we don't.
Yeah, no, I agree. But what would be the problem then? I mean, this shows to me that when you control, that white people have accumulated legacy wealth, they are the mode. Are they the mode? I think or actually, no, they're not the mode. Asians are the mode. I take that back. Yeah. Okay. Well, they're 37% of the incoming class of 2028. And again, those are the difference between 2027 and 2028 because of the Supreme Court decision to not allow race as a factor. So why wouldn't you want structures in place to limit the number of whites and Asians? Because given that there are only so many slots, that means that they would be denied to blacks and Hispanics.
So there's a ton here in your comment, Peter, and there's also just a ton in this graph. I could kind of go on about this sort of thing for quite some time. So I'll just sort of start in. I mean, first of all, so whites are underrepresented relative to their population percentage here. I mean, that's the first important thing to know. And you'll see this sometimes in some of the conversations about Silicon Valley leadership. They'll talk about, white supremacy and white overrepresentation. But when you actually look, it's really Asian Americans who are overrepresented. If you were also to pull out, as you kind of note, Ashkenazi Jews from the white category, not because, I mean, there's a whole conversation to be had about that, but not because they've not been considered white in American context, but because they're a different group. If you're kind of looking at middle American Christian whites, to kind of use that as a category, they would be even more badly underrepresented in more obvious ways relative to their percentage in the population. So you've got that. You've got the fact that Asian Americans are really the dramatically overrepresented group, but for the most part, people don't see this as a problem. Interestingly enough, I think the politics of this, I mean, it was kind of interesting, right? When this went to the Supreme Court, it was not a coincidence that it went in with Asian American plaintiffs rather than white plaintiffs. And I think there are some legitimate reasons that you can argue that they did this because, okay, well, Asian Americans had the highest scores overall, so the disparity was the most. But I think if you kind of look at the real politique of it, what it was these guys had to convince a bunch of conservative white justices to make this ruling. And I think the very savvy plaintiffs who put this up said this is going to be easier to do if it doesn't look like we're advantaging whites, if it looks like we're advantaging some other groups, that whites are so uncomfortable in advocating on their own behalf, even in the context of where they're actually being discriminated against, that it would just be more comfortable to do this with Asian American plaintiffs.
Sure.
Now, as far as the numbers for Blacks and Latinos, I think it's important to note, and you did, these are still probably overrepresented based on what we know from the Supreme Court case in terms of, if you look at academic indexes, the actual percentage that you would have if you were doing a strict merit admission. Now, having said that, again, because I'm a realist about politics, I actually think this is a reasonable endpoint that people will live with, even though I would personally advocate for just a strict merit approach, like let the chips fall where they may and let the racial kind of backgrounds fall where they may. I'm not, I've served in government. I'm not naive about politics. I think if you get these numbers that much lower, that much more disproportionate for some of these other groups, it's just going to be a really, really hard political sell. And I think in carving off a substantial number of those who are really the least qualified, you kind of wind up with groups in the Hispanic and Black category of folks who are certainly capable of doing that work. They're capable of succeeding. And it's a question of, okay, well, you're not giving it to a white candidate or an Asian candidate who is 10% more qualified, but they're both able to do it. And again, I want to state my point really clearly, which is I don't think we should have any consideration for racial categories. But I think in terms of the practical politics of it, I think this is a reasonable place that we might end up. I think the problem is, if you look at the history in California, when you originally had the ruling in the 1990s that banned affirmative action, you had these drops pretty dramatically at the beginning. And then basically the universities figured out how to game the system.
Exactly.
And by the end of that process, now they banned affirmative action again. But if you look, if you really squint, you can maybe see some areas in which maybe they're not fully representative demographically. But basically, the universities have found a way to cheat. And I think they're going to continue to do that.
So I think that's that Supreme Court case was Students for Fair Admission v. Harvard. So the moment that you say, well, the African Americans should be 1%, if you just look at the data, if it's strictly data driven,
right,
but they're 5%, that means that you're allowing a percentage, you're admitting a degree of systemic discrimination. This would actually be an example of systemic discrimination against Asians, right?
Against Asians and against white Americans, because they're both. The Asian Americans would be at the kind of,
but only a teeny amount against whites. But the real sufferers here really are Asian Americans. But I guess my point would be, again, arguing something I don't believe, of someone who's caught in the orbit of the ideology. What would be the problem against discriminating against Asian Americans? Fuck them.
Well, I just don't think you should discriminate against anybody on the basis of race. I don't want to be so cliched as to mention Martin Luther King and content of their character, but I actually will be that cliched. I think it's a good, when you're in a multi-ethnic democracy, and I think that I would not have made our democracy as multi-ethnic as it is, because I think it's a lot of challenge. I think diversity is not our strength, which is a broader conversation. I'm happy to have it, but given that that's the reality we're in, we do need to make sure that we need to consider that the groups need to have a seat at the table. Again, not because of my personal preference. I will argue that they
Right.
shouldn't, that you just let merit go. But I'm not so naive as to understand the politics. And I kind of feel like the politics of selling 5%, African Americans and 11% Hispanics
Yeah.
at Harvard or MIT, like I can sell that. Is it difficult? Yeah, but are people still at the table? Can you still find people? Are these people likely to be at least comparable to people who would have been admitted just on merit? Yeah, I think in many cases they will. But
Isn't
it's difficult. It's difficult, right? And it's not an ideal place for society to be, which is why I'm critical of the whole project.
sure. Okay, so isn't the argument then, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the reason you couldn't have a pure meritocracy, and for example, I'm a founding faculty advisor at the University of Austin, and they just started their first incoming class, and that's pure meritocracy. There's no race-based
Yeah,
admissions at all. It's just what are the numbers, what are the stats,
yeah.
what are the essays, etc. So, but isn't the reason for that you would create a permanent upper and lower class if you didn't have affirmative action? You would create a permanent upper class of Asians and a permanent lower class of African Americans.
I think that's part of it, and I think here is like a super secret element of this entire discussion that I think came up, which explains partially why a lot of Asian American groups were actually very lukewarm about
Hmm.
this lawsuit from the beginning. Which is not that they didn't think they would benefit, but I think a lot of Asians who had already kind of gotten into the Harvard, metaphorically speaking,
Hmm.
understand that if you went to a pure merit process that is just overwhelmingly Asian American, that actually power migrates away from these institutions to a degree,
Hmm.
that our political system is not going to put up with the type of outcome in which the most powerful positions in society are that disproportionately doled out, whether by merit or not, right? Like to that visible minority. And so I think there were a number of leaders in the Asian American community. Again, I'm not defending them. I'm just explaining where I think their thought process were. Who
Yeah.
said, we're happy to be discriminated against to a degree here because we've still got a disproportionately large seat at the table and we keep power within that institution. A 25% Asian American Harvard is still Harvard in terms of its power and access, whereas maybe a 55% Asian American Harvard, power begins to flow away to other institutions that are a little bit more demographically representative of the country. And so I think, those are the things that went in. Again, I want to stress, I'm not advocating for any of
Right.
this. I'm advocating for a merit approach, but I'm trying to understand practically how I think these things will play out politically.
Okay. So I'm having a hard time maintaining my posture because I want to want to attack that idea. So I'm just going to break character for a second, attack that idea. The problem with that, though, is that you destroy the legitimacy of the institution
Sure. Sure.
because you, that's what I think postmodernists get wrong about things is that they think that the power comes from the brand, but the
Right.
brand comes because I was just talking to my buddy about this last night. But the brand gains its power because there's something there that's good about it, and
Right.
so it's not okay. So back to the idea then. The idea is that white people have been in this country for a long time. They've accumulated wealth, they've passed it on to their kids. They have an advantage economically.
Yeah.
We know that it's not ubiquitous, but in most places, the school system is funded by the community, the tax revenue of the community. So they have
Right.
educational advantages. And if you look in poorer communities, it's not that they're discriminating against African Americans by necessity, but African Americans tend to be poorer, and then those schools. So it's an economic thing rather than a race thing. It's a class thing rather than a race thing.
Right.
But the argument still holds in that white people have had a long time to accumulate wealth, and that gives them an advantage. And so
Right.
why wouldn't we want to level the playing field either through affirmative action or through active systemic discrimination against whites
Right.
and Asians.
Right. Well, so I mean, I think the arguments for socioeconomic affirmative action, I'm not even comfortable in calling it affirmative action, because I think it's something different. It's just you are taking into account the background of somebody who comes. I mean, I think everybody understands that if a kid gets a 1,500 while they're living in a homeless shelter on their SAT, and their parents didn't graduate from high school, that is a more impressive candidate on the face of it than somebody who got a 1,540 on their SAT, but was doing SAT prep and all these other things. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have an inherent problem with taking it into account socioeconomic factors, as long as it's not really being done, as you frequently see, as a mere proxy for race. So, in fact, you're seeing this at UVA right now. If you look where the numbers really didn't move very much in the new admits, they're using socioeconomic factors, but they're not really using them because they care about socioeconomic diversity. They're just carefully calibrating it in a way that they can find another way to discriminate against white people. You see this to a degree. I don't know that this is still the system, but I'm pretty sure it is. Texas has something like a top 5 or top 10% system for the UT schools that was an attempt to get at the same type of thing. So if you're at the top 5% of your really lousy high school, you're kind of automatically admitted to one of the top schools in the system. That's not necessarily a terrible thing. Okay, I'm not saying that's bad. Sort of level the playing field in certain ways, but this was really being done as a proxy for anti-white racial discrimination. That's why they put it in. They didn't put it in because they were really concerned about the poor, or anything like that. And then I'd say finally, just there is one factual correction, which is if you actually look at school spending by race, there's very little difference by race. And in fact, my 5 kids who are in public school here in Montana, where I live, we are spending much, much less on their education, much, much less than, say, the average minority student in New York City or many, many other places, not just there. So it's a little bit of a fallacy. When you look at the breakdown by race, I think I even have it in my book, there's really almost no difference in school expenditure. So that's not where we're having inequities in the system.
Interesting. Okay. So let's get back to the anti-racism thing for a moment against whites. If the claim is that whites should be discriminated against as a form of equity, in other words, we want equal outcomes. In fact, VP Kamala Harris has repeatedly said that she has a little deranged video about equity. I don't know if you've seen the people climbing up the mountain.
Yes.
Have you seen that video? Okay, that's a little few minutes of crazy. So if we really do want equity, and I can't remember, maybe Ree can find it, how many times the word equity is used. It's been embodied in the federal government, and we do live in a republic, and you could call it a representative democracy. And people have voted for this. They voted in Biden, and they're getting what they voted for. They're getting equity. And so systemic discrimination against whites, that's the video there. And the key to the video for equity is that you all end up at the same place.
Right.
If we do want people to end up at the same place, then we need to do a few things. The first thing is we need to actively discriminate against people who have economic and academic success. Right. I mean, so what is your argument against the fact that we have voted in people who have explicitly, nobody's hiding this. It's in the documents. They're screaming this from the rooftop. It's not like it's a secret. They're telling us repeatedly, we want equity. We're giving you equity. We're bringing you equity. Why shouldn't the people be able to decide if that's what they want and they vote in Harris again, that we have systemic discrimination against white people? That's what people want. Why shouldn't we be able to do that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a few things. One, I think it's important that you noted that this is all going on in plain sight, and it's kind of one of the interesting things. And I kind of talk about this. I mean, honestly, if I were a more clever person, I probably would have written about a different topic, and I mean that in 2 ways. I mean, one, it's a little, it's challenging in terms of career, but secondly, like, I'd have to be like really smart to kind of like come up with some grand theory. Whereas maybe I'm not as smart, so I'm like, well, this is just sitting here right in front of me. They're telling me that, we're discriminating against you. It's good. All I have to do is kind of notice that and point out all the obvious ways that it's going on, and all I have to do is be brave, right? At least to a degree. And I can kind of come up with this book that's saying something that not everybody is saying. And so I think that comes up to it. But so, why is that a bad thing to say that we're going to
It's what people want. It's what they're voting in, someone who is systemically discriminating against people. So what's the problem?
So the deep constitutional answer, right, is that we were always wary of faction and majoritarian rule, and the notion in this country that the majority just gets to take away the rights of a minority by a 51% vote. I think that's been a pretty clear American tradition. Having said that, I think the more important thing, even than that, is the fact that this is just really, really dangerous in a multi-ethnic democracy, where you're going to tell one group, hey, just because of how you look, you're going to get less stuff. Like, that doesn't work out well. I mean, the history of multi-ethnic successful countries, empires, etc., it's not zero. Okay, I mean, you can go back and point to times in the Roman Empire where it was a successful multi-ethnic empire and they integrated it for a while, or even in the Ottoman Empire. I mean, there are times, so I don't want to say that it can't happen, but it's really hard. And, more often you get Hutus versus Tutsis in Rwanda, historically, at least within the deep history, or some version like that, Chinese in Indonesia. The record of, particularly when they become minorities, and whites are going to become a minority, just another minority in the US sooner rather than later, it's not great. And so the best way to get around that is just not to factor in race.
Okay. Well, I have two arguments against that. My first argument against that is that the Constitution was written by white people, and privilege will seek to preserve itself. So why should we look at a document that was very old, written by white people who owned slaves? So doesn't that inherently discriminate? Isn't that inherently itself repudiating?
Yeah.
And I'll let you answer that, and I'll give you my second objection.
Sure. So, I mean, I think, this is a common objection. Obviously, narrowly with respect to slavery, I mean, this is why we amended the document, right? Because it was inherently contradictory in certain respects, and that we were talking about all these rights, but we were carving out certain people from having them. And so I think, we've amended the Constitution, and we could continue to amend the Constitution if we felt like, if there was a true supermajority of society that felt like we were going down the wrong pathway. But more broadly, I think the political principles that they elucidated were not just relevant to their own very narrow time or a very narrow scope, but they were eternal and timeless, and they were about human nature and the nature of the political, or at least the nature of the political within a democratic republic. And so I think that the sorts of principles that they had there, in terms of checks and balances, and in terms of the sorts of rights we want to preserve, are just as relevant today as they were when they were originally put forward.
Yeah, you realize that nobody who buys into the ideology would accept that. Like, they don't accept timelessness. They don't accept yeah.
No, I mean, we're in a war of all against all. I don't have any illusions about the moment that we're in. And one of the, I mean, I'm very explicit about the fact that I did not just write this book for white guys. I haven't just done interviews with white interviewers. As I mentioned to you when we were off air, I'm talking to Wilfred Riley on his podcast in a couple of weeks.
Wilfred's awesome.
So it's not just that I'm just trying to have this just for a white audience. On the other hand, part of why I wrote this is I just accept that, our opposition is not going to accept this. And so I at least want white Americans to acknowledge the reality that they are living under, even though the system is trying to tell them, oh no, that's not what you're not seeing the thing in front of your face that you're seeing in front of your face. Because I think when we acknowledge reality, when all groups acknowledge at least some element of consensus reality, and we're not always going to agree, but we'll get at least somewhere, then we can begin to talk about, okay, well, this is our situation, so how do we best address this situation? But when we're still maintaining this public fiction that we have white privilege as dominating society or white supremacy, we're not going to get anywhere, right?
Yeah. Okay. So let's let's bracket that, because I do want to drill down a little more on the equity argument. So your argument, and I want to repeat back to you, make sure I understood it, was that there are constitutional protections against systemic discrimination and discrimination against people on the basis of race, and these are rationally derivable, timeless principles that we should yield to, as not only as Americans but as just sane, civilized human beings. However, with that being said, the equity argument, this is wholesale ideological capture of all of our institutions, and we have, I mean, it's just remarkable how this has overtaken the society and
Right.
replaced the word equality, and nobody questions it. Anybody who questions it, it's a Nazi or racist, etc.
Right.
But we're still left with the same problem, and the problem is that we have our institutions are equity pushers.
Yeah.
And if the victim of that equity is white people or Ashkenazi Jews or Asians, cold climate Asians, if that's the case, then I guess the democratic argument, you rebutted that if you accept, which they would not, but if you accept the constitutional protections. That's why we have a constitution, and the states
Right.
can make laws, but they can't violate the constitution. So,
Right.
but if the vox populi is to bring about the voice of the people, is to bring about equity as a way to remediate past social injustices, then it seems to me to be a kind of, in the literature called privilege preserving epistemic pushback. So you're arguing against, you're saying we shouldn't discriminate against white people, but that's only because you want white people to have their power. If you truly wanted an equity-based system, which the
Right.
will of the people do, especially if Harris gets in, if you truly want that, then you have to take steps to bring that about, equal outcomes, and that would mean, by definition, systemically discriminating against whites, Asians, and Ashkenazi Jews, cold climate Asians.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That is the logic of their position, and I think part of what I'm trying to do is force them to own the logic of their position in a very public way. And instead, what you have, and it's not a coincidence, and I've called. I mean, Tim Waltz,
Mm.
he's kind of a step and fetch it. He's a minstrel show, in my view, white middle American who is designed to kind of make this systemic anti-whiteness within the Democratic Party kind of palatable, to particularly to whites, particularly those who are maybe not, they don't love Trump for various reasons. You kind of have this friendly face. I think Biden, in his, I think he was diminished from the moment he ran first in 2020, but he was less diminished. I think
Sure.
he was very visibly, he was this kind of old, kindly, grandfathery type figure who was there to sell you kind of the anti-white systemic discrimination, that would be harder for a minority face to sell to white America. And so I think
Yeah.
that very much is part and parcel of where we are. And I think we're in a power struggle. We are in an ideological struggle. This is an uncomfortable position for the right, because the right has generally been, in America at least, very uncomfortable with wielding power. I mean, even almost ideologically, and I deal with this with a few folks on the right. They're not comfortable with using the state to do anything. There's kind of a minarchist tendency or a libertarian
Yeah.
tendency, a kind of a very discomfort with using power. And I understand that, and I'm even sympathetic to it to a degree. But when you have a hyper diverse society like ours, power is going to be exercised. So the question is, are you going to do it, or are your enemies going to do it?
When you say we're in a power struggle, what are the sides of the struggle? Like, who's in this struggle?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot, but I think there is one group that Harris is heading up in the Democratic Party that is a race-based anti-white spoil system. I'm not saying that's the only thing the Democratic Party is about, but I think at the core, that's what they're about. Again, I kind of document and talk about this in my book, and sort of put numbers behind what that actually looks like. And then there's this group that is not comfortable in sort of saying, well, we are going to be pro-white in some way, because that would be seen as racialist. in some way, or racist even, in a way that would make most of the people on the right coalition very uncomfortable. But simply to say that we want equal opportunity for everybody and no discrimination, and it's not a coincidence that it's always the right these days who are quoting Martin Luther King Jr. on the content of character. So I think those are the kind of two coalitions, and I think right now the left coalition really has the better of that, and I think you're just beginning to see the beginnings of a real pushback on that. And I intend this book to kind of be part of that discussion.
Yeah, I think what you said is true. It's a quotidian occurrence. I hear the right quoting MLK all the time now. So let's take a look at something. Are you optimistic about? Okay, let me even take a step back. If there was a so you're a Republican?
Yes.
Okay.
I served in the Trump administration. So, I mean, I guess that doesn't automatically make me a Republican, but it's a pretty good proxy.
And you were like Secretary of the Interior or something?
Yeah, I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary.
Deputy Assistant Secretary. Okay. So,
but I've been involved in Republican politics for.
Okay. So let me just ask you a question straight out. You seem like a super honest guy. Let's say there was a Republican running for office and a Democrat running for office, and the Democrat revealed all of his or her policy positions, and you liked almost none of them. You didn't like 90% of them. You liked 5%, and you were neutral to 5%. Let's just say, I'm just throwing this up. Okay. Okay. Hypothetically. And then there was a Republican running for office, but the Republican refused to tell you any of his policy positions, and he didn't write or she didn't write them down. And he didn't.
Yeah.
Would you vote? Who would you vote for?
Well, I would vote for the Republican on the general basis that by their affiliation with my party, I mean, there would be a reason why they're not. I mean, I suppose as like an extreme thought experiment, you can say, well, there's no reason that they're not revealing their positions. But I'm going to assume in a real political context that there would be some reason that they're not. And people affiliate with parties for a reason. So I'm going to make an Occam's razor assumption that this person, because they've chosen to identify with my party, would be more aligned with me. On the other hand, obviously, I wouldn't prefer that. Obviously, I prefer people to state all of their positions up front. If you wanted to do a weird hypothetical that would be maybe slightly more difficult for me to do, of a Democrat who I agreed with 50% of their positions versus a Republican who wouldn't tell me, then that I think would be a more difficult decision, perhaps, because I'm more of an ideologue than a partisan. I wouldn't necessarily just take it on faith. But I think, I think right now we've been through this long process. This wasn't obviously true, but the parties do pretty well. You can even see this in political science graphs, right? When you track the median voter, in 1992, they were kind of a lot of overlap in that Venn diagram. And when you look at them today, they're pretty far apart. So I think you can pretty clearly, if I know nothing else but the political party you're running in, I probably know a lot about whether I'm going to agree with you realistically.
Okay, so real quick, I want to get back to the anti-white racism thing in a second, but what did you mean when you say you're more of an ideologue?
Yeah, and I was saying that in a slightly self-deprecating way, obviously, because people don't consider being an ideologue a good thing. But I do mean that there's nothing magical about the word Republican or the Republican Party to me. I understand enough about politics to understand that we, in 99.9% of cases, we operate through political parties and we exercise power through political parties, and so that matters. But at the end of the day, just because you have an R after your name doesn't mean I like you. And in fact, I don't like particularly most of the elected Republicans. There are a number that I do like. I mean, I'm not going to say, oh, they're all bums, they're all terrible. There are a number who I think are good. But I'm more concerned with, like, do I think this guy is good or this woman is good than whether they happen to have an R after their name.
Okay, so let me ask you a question then. So let's say that you would articulate 5 of your core beliefs.
Yeah.
And whatever they may be. Political beliefs, not epistemological, metaphysical, or moral beliefs, like broadly political beliefs. and you were to be shown evidence to your satisfaction that those beliefs were not held on the basis of evidence, in fact, they even contradicted the existing body of evidence, would you change your mind?
Yeah. I mean, I think it depends, right? There are some things like I'm a religious Christian. Um, I am not a big apologetics guy. I respect that some people are, but I certainly just take some things on faith. And no matter how much evidence, I mean, I'm not saying that you could never show me evidence that would, like, if God were actually talking to you and you could convince me of that, and you were
Yeah.
saying, well, Christianity is wrong, that would certainly sway me perhaps. But um, uh, I don't. I like when religion is in a religion box, and I think it's very comfortable there, and I think it serves a very good social function as well as me having to believe it. And I'm not particularly interested in having religious arguments with people. I mean, to me, that's a thing that I take on faith. On the other hand, in fact, I think this has been one of the dangers of the kind of rampant atheism that we've had in society. I know you're an atheist, as I recall, Peter, but
It's all my fault. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
but I think there's a conservative blogger named Ace of Spades who I once quoted, and he said, I'm unusually like the right for the right. I'm a secularist,
Hmm.
but the problem with the left is that they're very poor secularists. And in removing God from the equation, they've actually let religious thinking pop into every single other mode of their thought. And I
Hmm.
actually think that's a very powerful
Right.
critique, because I think so much of what we're seeing with wokeness, anti-whiteness, the sort of way in which these become like metaphysical categories, is religion for atheists of a sort. And I'm not saying that every atheist believes that. Obviously, there's conservative atheists, etc. But I do think that that's a danger. So there
Yeah.
are sort of limited areas that are off the table for debate for me, because I just consider them religious beliefs or something akin to them. But for most things, I'm always
But none of those are in
going to
the
look at evidence.
none of those are in the political realm, though. They're all in the religious or metaphysical realm.
Yeah, although of course religion does intersect with politics and people's political views. So um, I don't think that I don't know. Just because I'm saying, well, I put religion in this category, I'm not so naive as to think that there can't be some sort of overlap, right? Or that there's no effect of my religious views on my political views. I think that would be naive. But I would say that for the vast
Okay.
majority of views, if I'm enough of a rationalist that if you presented me with good contrary evidence, I would change my mind. It's the famous I think it's Keynes, who I normally hate, but he said, he was criticized for changing his view on something, and he said, well, when I'm presented with new facts, I change my opinion. What do you do? And that's kind of how I would view it. Any sort of secular political discussion.
Okay. Let's get back to the anti-racism thing. So, what do you think is the main cause of the problem? Why is this happening?
I think it's okay. I mean, there's a few things going on, but some of it is just a function of diversity, and it's inherent. And it's one of the reasons why I'm not ceteris paribus a big fan of diversity.
Yeah.
Um, you have different groups in society, and they are competing for power. And in race, it's arguably the most visible way. Again, it's not the only cleavage we can have. I mean, we had Catholics and Protestants blowing themselves up and blowing each other up in Northern Ireland in living memory, and you've had that, of course, elsewhere. Um, but it's a real obvious one, right? It's a real obvious, like, I am different than you if you look different. From an evolutionary perspective, you would certainly say that as well. You're not my kin, right? So it's a hard nut to crack, and invariably groups compete as groups for power as part of politics. And I just accept that as a reality, whether I like it or not. And then I think beyond that, there's some sort of weird things going on with white people's psychology. And in fact, my follow-up book that I think I'm going to write on this is on the white left and how destructive I think it is and why. And there are weird things having to do with the level of inherited guilt, and not because I think they have guilt, but because they, for whatever psychological reason, they are susceptible to this type of contagion, intellectual contagion. That you have certain things, and in fact, you see this, and I talk about this in my book. So they have sort of social surveys, and these are not kind of like, these are very, very reputable general social survey type questions. These aren't some partisan people, and they essentially ask you to rate your warmth for your race and other races. And what you see for pretty much every group, regardless of ideology, is what we'd call an in-group preference. And it's a little higher for conservatives and it's a little lower for liberals. But whether you're an Asian American conservative or an African American liberal, you have an in-group preference.
Right.
Within reason, that's not a problem. I mean, that's to be expected. I prefer my mother to some random woman on the street. The one group for whom this is not true, and it sticks out like a completely sore thumb in the data, are white liberals. White liberals have a huge outgroup preference. And if you see this in a bar graph, I mean, it's shocking. And so they think that white people are dumber, more criminal, et cetera. And so I think interrogating that particular problem within the white community is also kind of explains some of what we have going on.
Yeah, ostensibly it would seem to be apocryphal, but if you really think about, like, if you truly think about it and you look at the data, because I've seen that and I've drilled down on that and I've looked at some of the methods on that, and it also does seem to comport with our understanding of the problem. It makes me think of something else. Excuse the tangent, but to what extent do you think that people choose their beliefs?
Well, that's a free will question. And as a Calvinist, I'm not even sure how to answer it. But
okay, you're a Calvinist. Okay, well that changes things. Okay,
I go to a Calvinist church. I'm more or less Calvinist depending on what time of day you hit me and on what issue we're discussing.
Yeah,
but I do like believe
predestined.
I do believe in predestination, but and again, not as a belief that I would interrogate or have a big argument with you about. I just happen to I believe that, it just makes sense to me. But I do think that I'm not such an extreme Calvinist on this point. I do think that we also have free will within that, and that we do have some significant choice of our belief, although obviously biology, social structures, other things all come into play as well. So
yeah, it's interesting because I one of the things that Reed and I do is we go around the world and we do this street epistemology stuff, spectrum street epistemology, and we're going to start moving into different spaces now. I don't want to talk about it now, but one of the things that we ask people all the time is, what would it take to change your mind? I think that's one of the most important questions. And I think I agree with David Deutsch, the physicist from Oxford, and others, that I think you could construct an entire educational system built around falsification in the moral realm. That's called defeasibility. What would it take to change your mind? We do that in science. I mean, science is Karl Popper science. And I am, and I'm thinking about that. I'm mentioning this in relation to, because you said liberal. I don't know if it was liberal that don't prefer their in-group racial preferences.
Yeah.
I think I remember it being so people misuse the term liberal. I'm not saying you did, but people misuse. They interchange the liberal and leftist. But I wonder,
left wing, whatever you want to call it. I think they probably self-described as liberals, but you and I, of course, are aware that like liberal does not necessarily mean liberal today. But people who
correct. In fact, it means illiberal.
Yeah. But people who self-describe as liberals, because as far as I know, these are I don't know how else they would be categorizing other than self-describe. That's how they're answering these questions.
Yeah, I wonder like what. I wonder if you ask those defeasibility questions, like what would it change to take to change? Like why do you? And I wonder to what extent those people have sincerely thought about their beliefs, or they've just latched on to a community, a virtue. I gave a talk a few years ago, mortally identified. Oh, there it is. How racial groups rate each other. Blow it up totally. White respondents, Hispanic respondents, Black respondents. Thanks, Reed. Asian respondents, and then the mean there. And wow, that's fascinating to me. 60 to 90%. Yeah.
Right. This is just another way of kind of looking at that same data that shows a very substantial in-group preference for other groups. But what's really causing that is if you took out liberal whites, I think whites would look a little more normal, right? But this just kind of is yet another demonstration that white people as a whole, I'm obviously generalizing, are the least ethnocentric people in the United States. That's what the data shows, and I would argue that's what, frankly, practice has showed. I mean, China is not inviting in millions of white people to go settle within China.
Yeah.
So
It's interesting. My daughter's from China. We adopted her at 2.5, and I don't. It's just fascinating to me. There's this. I don't know if we want to get into this, but there's this whole thing that if you adopted someone of different race, you're like an international kidnapper, like a transracial, or not
yeah,
transracial, but you're like a racial kidnapper. And I got to say, like, these people, it's the most bizarre thing to me. It's like all these people who go around freaking out about homosexuality. I don't think about homosexuality for like 2 seconds. Like, it literally never crosses my mind. And
right.
every time I hear someone do that, I'm like, oh, thou doth protest too much.
Yeah,
But I think it's interesting when you have an obsession with race or some identity factor, and I'm wondering if, and again, I tend to think about things in terms of an intervention. I wonder if there's a way to intervene, either in a large scale intervention or a kind of cognitive intervention, to have a liberal, secular kind of intervention, or an intervention in the school systems, the educational systems. And of course, for that, you'd have to just burn them all down and then redo them. I don't know if any intervention is possible at this point
right.
because the whole thing is ideologically corrupt. But to start thinking about the problem less in terms of things that have an identity level salience, like, as it's been said many times before, your sexual orientation is probably the least interesting thing about you, right? Not you, but one in general, or
Sure.
one's race is,
Right.
and nobody thinks about race when they're. I told myself I wouldn't talk about jujitsu on the podcast, but nobody thinks about race when, like, someone's on top of you trying to strangle you. They're thinking like, holy shit, someone's on top of you trying to strangle you, right?
Right.
So I think that we've become race obsessed in this country. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking about what you think are the possible solutions we should pursue to get out of this. It's not even a quagmire, it's a
Right.
freaking catastrophe,
Right.
right? What
Yeah.
what do we how do we get over this problem when we have all these people running around who are utterly obsessed with, and
Right.
you've written about it too, it's like the the claiming that this is some far right thing or some alt right thing. And I remember when I would consistently see, uh, like 2 years ago, Asians being assaulted by African Americans, and
Right.
then we were told that this is white supremacy.
Right. I write about this very thing a lot in the
Yeah,
book. And in fact, I did one of the things I did even for this book is my friend Ying Ma, who has actually written she's a Stanford law grad, very, very bright, and was actually involved in both of the California civil rights initiatives in the late 1990s and a few years ago that banned affirmative action. But she's talked about her frustration with a lot of Asian American activists who have kind of pulled this bait and switch, which is obviously not true. I document in the book how we're talking just again with a lot of statistics and analysis about how we really are blaming white supremacy for black people in San Francisco and Oakland attacking Asian Americans, and how I call it a blood libel, which it is. I mean, there's just no other more polite term I can have for it. I mean, white people have nothing to do with that, but Asian Americans don't want to have that other discussion. And I think the sad thing, and again, something I wrote about in the book, is fine. The activist groups you kind of expect. Like, I don't have great, expectations for some, Asian American race-based group to not be kind of running a racket around this. But what was really disappointing was that at the height of this kind of frenzy, we had major Asian American business groups, like with major political and business leaders, people who were very prominent people in Silicon Valley, taking out a full page Wall Street Journal ad, repeating some of these same blood libels. And those are people who I expect they have other things going on in their lives besides racial activism. And I also just expect them to behave more responsibly. And sadly, they didn't.
Yeah, it's just heartbreaking what I've seen happen to the country. It's just heartbreaking. Okay, let's go over some of the mushy season. gifted a membership. Mushy's a friend of the show. Thanks, Mushy. Appreciate that. And a coffee for Reed. Thank you. Reed deserves many, many coffees. Reed is doing a very good job at taking sugar out of his coffee. So we're very happy about that. So I can't even pronounce that, Reed. I don't even know what it is. For $5, here's the question. Should opponents of anti-white racism promote genetic explanations for group differences? Great question.
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm glad you asked it. And it's something that I've gotten on occasion from my more adventurous interviewers. I am skeptical of that as an approach, not because I don't think that, at least in the political realm, I think the right realm to have that type of a discussion is in the academic realm. And yes, I know how difficult it is to have an honest discussion about something like that in the academic realm right now. But I think when you do that, the reality is you're just going to get into a dialogue around superiority and inferiority that is not going to resolve itself practically, that's not going to be productive, that is going to just lead to more tension. And so again, at least in terms of the political actors, I just think it's not, again, and I look, there are people who talk about this very openly, who have discussions about this. I'm not trying to say, oh, you can't discuss it. I'm trying to say you should not discuss it with a notion that somehow you're going to get everybody to magically accept your version of the racial hierarchy and then everybody's problems are going to go away. What I think is just useful is to say, look, discrimination is wrong. We accept that there are maybe multifaceted ways that genetics, environment, whatever, social society, whatever you want to throw at it, could be playing a role here. But like the one thing that's not happening is like whites are not like holding their thumb on the scale to oppress other people. So let's stop discriminating by race and let the chips kind of fall where they may. So again, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that we can't have those type of discussions. I'm just saying that in the political realm, I don't see those types of discussions as likely leading to a solution that is going to be palatable for all groups. And so, it wouldn't be what I'd lead with. Let me just put it that way.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So there's a lot there, and we could have a lot of, we could definitely drill down.
I don't touch that in my book at all. Because
I was going to say it's a conversation for another day that we could have a lot there. But if there were systemic discrimination against groups of people, why wouldn't it be in entertainment? Why wouldn't it be in sports? Why wouldn't it be in football or basketball? Why would it only be academic?
Right. Well, and again, I agree. I mean, this is why, I do think that you can find pretty much any groups that you name, like any way that you could slice and dice humanity, I think you will find some level of inherent difference. And then you can have a discussion about, well, how much of that difference is environmental and how much of it is genetic, and if, how much of it might be amelioratable. Yeah. Those are all fine. Those are all fine discussions to have, but
let's take a look at this. And there's another one, Reed, if you could even find another one, but this is good for now. The median household income by race, ethnicity of household head. Asians are at the top, and if it goes from 1990 to 2022. White, non-Hispanic, all races, Hispanic, and Black.
Yeah.
So Reed, that's the one I'm looking for right there. Okay, this is amazing. Median household income in the United States by ethnic group. Have you seen this?
I have, and I talk about this in the book as well. And I even go into not just like the thing that you have here, but I think this is actually quite relevant for people who, insist that it's just discrimination. You can look at Turkish Americans, you can look at Ecuadorian Americans. These are sort of you can look at Igbo Americans from Nigeria.
I'm sorry. Let me just pause you a second. The reason I'm pausing is because I don't mean to interrupt you, or maybe I do, but Turkish Americans are more or less considered white. Ecuadorians are more or less considered white. But if you look at this, the number one median household income in the United States by ethnic group is Indian Americans, $100,500. Filipino Americans, $83,300. Taiwanese Americans, $82,000. None of these are white. $82,000. So if there's a kind of white supremacy going on,
right,
the white people are doing a terrible job at it.
Yeah,
Sri Lankan Americans are next at
yes.
74,600. Japanese Americans, 72,000. Malaysian Americans, Chinese Americans, Pakistani, maybe you could consider them white, but white Americans are like, so if there really was systemic discrimination, you
Right.
wouldn't see those outcomes like that.
No, of course not. Of course not. So that's one obvious example. But what I also show in the book is that I can even pull from groups that, I mean, you kind of did a racial analysis there, and African Americans were at the bottom, but I can pull from Black subgroups like Ghanaian Americans or Igbo American Nigerians, and they are above the white average too. And so if you have a theory for systemic, anti-Black discrimination or anti-Hispanic discrimination, you have to explain to me why Igbos are actually doing really well, but Somalis are down here in terms of some sort of white, preference for Igbos over Somalis. And I think at that point, you're kind of grasping at straws. And then, of course, you point out that Asian Americans are at the top of the heap. And one of the things I talk about a lot in the Unprotected Class is the level of Asian erasure, as I call it, that happens in all these analyses that attempt to show white people at the top of the heap.
That's exactly correct. Okay, so let me again go back to the posture of devil's advocate. Okay, this is going to this may break your brain a little bit, but I'm going to do it to you anyway. The problem with that chart is that it denies the lived experiences of individuals who are people of color who make less.
Right.
So the problem with that chart is that it traffics in the realm of evidence, but we know it's true not through evidence, but through our own lived experience. How do you respond to that criticism?
Right. Well, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, Peter, because again, I'm not maybe fully familiar with everything that you argue, but I think of you as very much a rationalist. And you're making an argument there, and I think quite intentionally. I'm not suggesting that you're not aware you're making the argument this way.
I don't believe that at all.
Right. Right. You don't believe that. Like, my answer is just to be very rationalist about it. Like, it's like, well, tough. This is what the numbers say. You don't have a claim for vicious discrimination because if you did, these numbers would probably look a lot different. So I'm sorry, your lived experience just is not going to, trump reality here. But at the same time, I'm very, I don't want to use the word comfortable, but it's the first that came to mind. I mean, I accept that politics, and I mean that with a capital P, is not a rational phenomenon, and it never has been. And I think people who expect politics to obey rational formulas, and I know many of them, and many of them are very well intentioned, are often extremely dismayed with politics because it's not in the nature of politics to obey rational formulas. And so that's a long way of saying that the thing that you're talking about with lived experience is unfortunately very real, and it's a political thing. And in a democracy where everybody gets a vote, it's not going to go away. We have to deal with it. And again, it's one of the problems with hyperdiversity.
I admire your equanimity and the way you handle that idiotic, insane question. So you've said you just said that something that if you said 2 years ago or 3 years ago, you would have been tarred and feathered. You think that diversity is not our strength,
right?
Could you unpack that, please?
And I did say that more than 2 years ago, and in fact was tarred and feathered. So you're correct. I think it's not. I mean, it's sort of interesting. I talk in the book about the phrase "diversity is our strength." Actually, as best people can tell, comes from the great conservative intellectual Dan Quayle, who, when he was vice president of the United States, after the Los Angeles riots, was like talking to a Japanese business group. This was at the time Japan was kind of riding high. So this is the early 1990s. And they were sort of appalled at what they were seeing and saying, we're very uniform in Japan. We don't have these sorts of things. And Dan Quayle said something, and it kind of ended with, no, diversity is our strength. And I just don't buy that. I think that unity is broadly a strength in a society. Now, you can go too far, right? Like if you go to the extreme of unity, it's just fascism, okay, where everybody is sort of forced to believe the same things and act the same way in a totalitarian state. So I'm not suggesting that a degree of diversity cannot even be beneficial. I think it can be. But I think more broadly, it helps when the American people consider themselves one people, when we have what we might call an ethnogenesis, which is what I think you kind of talk about. What are the solutions? And some of these I talk about in the book. I think we've got to have a new American ethnogenesis. And I think that starts with, frankly, closing the border, because it was when we closed the border in 1924 that over the next 40 years, we had the last really significant American ethnogenesis, where Italians and Irish and Polish people became white Americans. Effectively, they became
Right.
I'm obviously oversimplifying, right? But they became a mass that saw themselves as one people. And I think the only solution back is to see ourselves as one people with the same story, the same putative ancestors at some level, although there's obviously fudging of that around the edges, and the same history. And we can't keep doing that in a hyper diverse environment, that we continue to add more and more diversity. In fact, that is a recipe for social strife of all types.
Yeah, it's there's an expression in science fiction: 1,000 repetitions equals one truth. If you
Yeah.
repeat something enough, people will believe that diversity is our strength. Diversity is our strength. I mean, it's a believe all women. There are a lot of ridiculous things that people have said and replied over and over again.
Yeah.
What is the most frustrating thing to you about being in the space you're in?
Yeah. I'd say a couple things. One is the occasional folks nominally on my side who simply lack the courage of their convictions and
Mm,
therefore sort of undermine the narrative. This has gotten a lot better. I mean, you sort of alluded to, a few years ago, you would have been tarred and feathered. Even just in the time I've been writing this book, things have gotten better. And so that's been encouraging. I'd say, one of the other things is, and I really try to talk and write about this very precisely because it is a controversial subject. But when I'm saying something like diversity is our strength, is not our strength, I'm not bashing people who don't look like me. I'm saying diversity inherently, even if the diverse people had much higher human capital than me, they were smarter,
mm,
they were better looking, they were better at sports, you name it. It's the inherent. So I'm not bashing diverse people or diverse Americans or saying they're not part of the American story or they can't be American. I'm saying diversity in and of itself, no matter how wonderful the diverse people are, is a problem. And so, I try to make these types of points very accurately. And it can be frustrating, of course, when people just then hear what they want to hear, which is, like their little worst case scenario.
Let me ask you a question. I love doing the show because I get to ask people things that I've been thinking about. Unfortunately, I don't get diverse people on the show. They won't talk to me. But let me ask you a question. So Eric Kaufman from the UK said something. He's a professor over there. I've become friendly with him. He
He
said
read a
something.
very complimentary review of my book. So yeah, I'm
Oh
very
yeah, yeah.
familiar.
Yeah, he's great. Matt Goodwin's great. Those guys are great. They're just
Yeah.
really have made me help me think more deeply and challenge some of my assumptions about things. But
Yeah.
anyway, what do you think about this? Because he said this to me, and I've been thinking about this, and then subsequent to that conversation, I've been looking the things up that he's said
Yeah.
to me. So there's a lot of data now on who contributes to treasuries, who takes away from treasuries, who commits crimes, who doesn't
Yeah.
commit
Yeah.
crimes. And there's certain groups like the Somalis are always in the
Yeah.
worst offenders, like universally everywhere
Yeah.
you go. And then
Yep.
the Japanese are the lowest offenders.
Right.
What do you think about having an immigration policy that's race blind, but based on empirical data showing who the main contributors to crime are in a way, and who contributes the most crime, who doesn't, who contributes to the treasury, who doesn't, and you
Right.
would form an immigration policy based upon that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So I've kind of had this conversation a little bit. I talk about, having a policy that might be colorblind but not culture blind. Um,
Correct. That would be
and
it. Correct.
and I think if you did it in too kind of crude a way, I think it could cause some problems. But I think that, yeah, of course we should look at, like, do people from these groups um, tend to contribute a lot, right? Or, like, do they succeed in society? Maybe the reason they're failing in society is all society's fault. but it doesn't matter to me, right? Like, it's just a question of like, are they doing well? Are they not? Now, does that mean that I'm going to turn down an ace Somali computer programmer in favor of, a Japanese janitor in a merit-based immigration system? No,
Mm.
it doesn't. But it does suggest that those could be factors along the edges, and I am comfortable with that. And in fact, I've specifically gone after the Somalis are really the one group, immigration to Minneapolis and the Midwest in particular, because I think it was just an example of
Mm.
a group that clearly, from moment one, they struggled. It was obvious they were going to struggle. They took these areas that were just super high functioning, high trust societies, and they've now made them gang ridden. You've got crime, you've got
Oh
all these
yeah,
sorts of
yeah, yeah.
things that are really negative. And I sort of say, obviously, again, I'm not saying that just by virtue of being Somali, you should be eliminated if you have all sorts of other wonderful things that you're bringing to the table. But I say, if we can't say that mass Somali immigration to Minneapolis was maybe not a good thing, like, then you're not really for ever restricting any immigration at all. So I think it's like a really good litmus test. And it's one of the reasons why, again, I think Tim Walz really fails this very, very badly. And I think it's really instructive, again, that he was picked, and the fact that he doesn't get a lot of questions about that. So I think it's relevant. And guys like Eric are interesting because Eric is a small L liberal. I'm not. But he goes about these problems in a slightly different way because of that. And I think, it can be useful to have dialogues between small L liberals and conservatives with our different priorities in terms of how we harmonize that.
Okay, we got a couple of super chats. Reed, do you mind throwing those up? We have to start demanding. Trader Bear's a friend of the show for $5. We have to start demanding receipts when anti-racists say there is systemic racism. Where is it? What can't you do that a white person can do? Yeah, you want to take that because I have a few thoughts on
Yeah,
that.
of course. I mean, I again, one of my core. I agree with Trader Bear. I mean, one of my core things in the book is like, call it out. This is like, part of it is just speaking out, saying, hey, we're not going to let you just go around saying this stuff that isn't true. So, put up or shut up. And I think that this is, you need to be quite that confrontational when you say it, but demanding evidence is really important and really useful. And I think it should be the standard for any sorts of claims like this.
Yeah, I'm gonna add to that and push back on this if you want. It's not enough to demand evidence. People have to value evidence, and they have to be slaves to evidence. And now I'll really push back. If you want people to value evidence, then there can be no domain in your life that you would not be a slave to the evidence, including religion, including faith, including
Right,
if you truly, then you have to model that behavior for others,
right,
because then they can always say, well, you have your exception, I have my exception.
right. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, again, I mean, you, as I understand you, and from our previous conversations we've had, offline, I think you're a small liberal and a rationalist in that way, and so I understand why you feel that way. My view is that, religion can exist, and in fact is healthy for most people in society, right? Like, you and I are the prototypical weird people, right? And the Western educated, et cetera. I don't mean
Right.
you might be weird in other ways too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That I just accept that most people are not going to want to interrogate their lives on that extreme a way. And I think that religion, as long as it stays within its realm, which is a very important realm, at least to me, in terms of how one governs one's life, personal life. But I think I'm comfortable with not. I don't need to overthrow every belief system in society as long as it's just presented as, this is belief. Now, when it begins to move into an explicitly political realm, then I think it's okay for you to ask me about evidence, right?
Yeah. I see this a lot with the trans movement.
Yeah.
And Schellenberger has talked about this. A lot of people have talked about this, and I find myself, I find it to be deeply disturbing. Perhaps that's another conversation another day. All right, Reed, let's throw out the other super chats we got. Mushy season. We love mushy season. The forum is alive with debate. Thanks, everyone. All right. Thanks, Mushy. And then we got one more super chat. Okay. So the chat was sorting out religion. As far as I could surmise, it seeks to answer, where did I come from? Where am I going? What is right and wrong? And what is the purpose of being?
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And again, I make particularistic claims for religion, and I would urge you to adopt it. But again, almost as now getting back on Calvinism, which may be
Yeah.
sort of an extreme opposite view of yours in some way. But I mean, I think the way that true Calvinists, at least originally as as demonstrated, would be that you're not actually trying to convince people that they're the predestined to be saved. You show through your good and positive behavior in society that in fact kind of what you're doing is right and you're sort of on the right path. And that's kind of like the happy way to me to think about Calvinism and predestination in a
Mm,
religious context.
mm.
So but I think that those are this is a totally fair way to look at religion.
Yeah, so that's from Nathan Howlett. Yeah, for $10. Where did I come from? Where am I going? What is right and wrong? What is the purpose of being?
Yeah.
Cool, Nathaniel. Thanks, Nathaniel. And we have another one from Trader Bear. A lot of people want to ask you a lot of questions. That's cool. Trader Bear, good friend of the show, for $5. Woke is the stench of postmodernism, which is one of the major problems with it. No objective truth.
Yeah.
Thus, I don't have to provide evidence. Yeah, so it's that the less so that there's no objective truth, but that truth has mediated itself through the power differentials and power relations, and
Right.
that's how we come to know things. And because there are always inherent power dynamics in things, Foucault had one word for that: power knowledge.
Yeah.
Then we lose. It just mediates all of our perceptions,
Right.
particularly in the social. I never watch things outside of science fiction, but I watched years ago Downton Abbey. I don't know if you've
Sure. Yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, yeah. It was interesting. They showed the lives of the I don't know what they call the servants. I don't even know what they call them
Yeah.
in
Servants. Sure.
Britain. But and it was so interesting, like, because you got a view of the servants, you got a view of the upper class, you got a view of how they interacted, and like most postmodern ideas, there's a kernel of truth in all of this stuff. It's just then you take that and you go to Crazyville. And
Right.
I'm just thinking of a lot of
But
stuff.
that's right. I mean, even for me, I mean, I believe in capital T truth as a result of my religious belief. But at the same time, I'm definitely not a postmodernist or a fan of Foucault or anything like that. But I would, of course, acknowledge that the way that what is supposedly truth is presented to us is absolutely mediated by societal structures, by power structures. So I wouldn't deny that. But the problem is, of course, that the postmodernists take that small grain of truth and they just run with it in all sorts of places where it shouldn't go.
Yeah,
Right.
and then they claim that it's not objectively true. By the way, you mentioned weird. Talking to Joe Heinrich on Thursday, I think he coined the term
He coined that term. Yeah.
the term weird, and I've been seeing it. I've been seeing that term a lot. What do you think what do you think is a current misunderstanding that people have about the positions you hold? And I don't mean to be hyper local in that.
Yeah.
I mean, like, more globally. Like, what do people in the US misunderstand about some of your ideas?
Well, I think they feel like if somehow my program, and I'm not saying everybody, but the people who would be more critical would be like, if we follow these ideas, we're going to wind up in a big racial conflict. And I would argue exactly the opposite. I would say if we don't follow my ideas, we're going to wind up in a racial conflict because we're asking people to accept fundamental things and fundamental elements of how we structure society in terms of power that are not
Yeah.
true. And so the way out of this thicket, again, I kind of close my book with this is to say, you're like, really, like, the way out of this thicket for all of us is to kind of start with at least some significant subset of what I'm talking about that we can agree on. And I think at the base level, that ought to be that we treat people in the same way, regardless of what color skin pigmentation they happen to have, as best we can, understanding that that's imperfect and that that's the only way to really function in a multi-ethnic democracy without being at each other's throats. So, I think maybe it's frustrating to me that people see me as coming in and trying to stir up controversy or problems, whereas I see myself as I'm doing the only thing at a cost to myself, by the way, personally, right?
Totally,
Um,
100%. Yeah.
because I want to avoid problems, because it's that important to me as somebody with 5 kids who are going to grow up and have a stake in this country, um, to avoid these problems, to deal with these problems. And so I think maybe that's the biggest frustration, is that people who don't understand that.
It's crazy. I see a lot of stuff online. I like literally never have problems with Black people or Hispanic people, or in fact, quite the contrary. I like literally have never. I just do not think I've had I think a lot of these things are completely overblown, and it's how you deal with these things. It's how you deal with when people approach you, or people are angry, or um, it could just be because I tend to relax in combat, or in adversarial relationships. I just get very relaxed. I don't know why. I think it's just a
Mm.
disposition I have. And then have you seen this thing? This is a top notch idiots. Have you seen this?
No.
Okay, dude, this is the craziest thing ever. Basically, these guys, that guy and that other guy, they go around and they ask gangsters. They say gangsters like, you want to get popped or whatever, and they flash fake gang signs at gangsters. Yeah, there they are. Or they just stand and they just look at them. And yeah, I mean, it's crazy. It's these
Yeah.
guys are truly insane, and
Yeah.
like they get guns pulled on, like that guy right there.
Yeah.
He just looks at him, and he asks, and it's so. And never once in all of these things, when they approach these people, has race ever been an issue.
Yeah.
It's just how you treat people.
Sure. Sure.
And if you haven't had a chance, it's just an
Well, there's an
extraordinary.
infinite number of people doing interesting things on the internet, right? Like, and whenever you go on one of these, you always learn about some new one that you were not aware
Yeah,
of.
and I mention that only because I think that, I don't know. I just think that the whole obsession with it's just so overblown. This
Yeah.
racial obsession we have, and
Yeah.
it's just treating people with decency and kindness. And almost never in these things does that. Yeah, that guy is truly insane. Someone says that's correct.
No, absolutely right. I hated to have to write this book, and in fact, I thought about writing this book for years,
Yeah,
and I kept waiting. I was like, well, somebody else will write it, right? Like, it's a little bit like, um, uh, from the Bible with Jonah. God tells him, go to Nineveh. God is telling me to go to Nineveh, and I'm like, I don't know that I really want to go to Nineveh, so I'm gonna like escape. And then God sends the big fish to swallow him up, and then he says the next time, go to Nineveh. Okay, fine. Like, that's kind of how it was like for me. I didn't want to write this. I mean, I thought, well, somebody else can write it, somebody more famous can write it, somebody smarter could write it, whatever it would be. And then finally, I just kind of realized that I really felt strongly that this book needed to be written. I felt that I was qualified to write it, and I just had to kind of bite the bullet and write it, even though, of course, I'd rather be writing about I'd love to write about arts and culture and all these other things, that really animate me much more than what the color of my skin is. But this is such an important topic, and people were shying away from it. And I was in a position where I was able to speak, truthfully about it. And so I decided to do that.
yeah. You've got a ton of opprobrium because you've done so. And sometimes when someone speaks bluntly about facts and evidence, they accuse them of all manner of heinousness. But
Yeah.
I don't think it's I don't think it's profligate. I think it's a valuable use of your time, and I'm really really glad. I've read a lot of your stuff. I haven't read the book, but I've read a lot of stuff you've written. I just want to have a couple more. You're generating a lot of chats today, man.
Great.
So I can't pronounce this individual's name.
Nathan Confidence. Yeah, I know him.
Yeah, tell us about him.
So, I mean, I don't know him personally, but he's written stuff. I know particularly he's gotten in trouble for some things he's written on race and science, and he also had a very lively discussion. He was at Cambridge, I believe, although I think they basically got rid of him for wrongthink. But he'd engaged in some debates with I'm just blanking on his name, but Kevin McDonald, who was a sort of prominent academic anti-Semite.
Yeah.
But he'd engaged in good faith debates with him, where he said, I'm really going to, take on your evidence and tell you why I think he's wrong. So, Nathan seems like a pretty brave guy. He's a little bit more autistic than me, and I don't mean that in a critical way, but just like I think he's less political. He's less concerned about political, and he's just more about like, okay, well, here's what I see as the truth, and I'm just going to spit that out. And then look, there's room for people, in society that's a really important role. I think my role is to really try to be very practical about coming up with solutions. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, and that comes at a great personal cost to you. Or get another super chat. Yay, we're getting a lot of super chats. Thanks. This all goes to, none of this goes to me. This all goes to the show. Nathaniel Howlett for $10. Thanks for touching on that. I just want to say thanks to Peter. I've been following you since the Soko Squared stuff. Moral courage is a rare trait. Much love to the show from Canada. Well, thanks, Nate. We appreciate that. Man, what's going on in Canada now? That's a real, like, holy moly.
It's crazy.
I just tweeted out something that another friend of the show wrote about what's happening with medical education and medical treatment in Canada. And again, let's be blunt and honest about this. These are really American exports. What's going on? Yeah. There it is. The Radical Reformers. Lee Rivers wrote that. That if you haven't read that, that's a great piece. I read that just this morning.
Well, and their immigration puts ours to shame in terms of like the percentage of foreign-born population. And the thing is, they're not even doing that on the top of, I mean, we're a society that has always had some level of diversity from 1619 on, right? Like, but even before then, arguably. But we have some way of processing that within an American context. Whereas even 40 years ago, Canada was pretty much demographically uniform. I mean, it was like the Scots, arguing with the English or whatever, right? Like that was diversity in Canada. And they've just decided to run this huge uncontrolled experiment.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just crazy to me.
It's totally insane to me. Have you, we have to go in a couple minutes, but have you, my buddy Gad Sad has been tweeting out, and I think, I haven't spoken to him in a little while, but I think that from what I've read, I should reach out to him, but he's Jewish. He fled Lebanon and he feels unsafe. Brian Keating, my friend, the physicist, gave a testimony for the Senate. He feels unsafe as someone as Jewish. And I mean, this is so disturbing to me. I mean, this should you shouldn't just be disturbed by it. You should actually be freaked out by this. Like, this is serious shit. This is not playtime anymore. This is serious.
No, it's crazy. I mean, and that's the thing. This may be a good way to kind of semi-wrap up, which is to say this whole thing. I mean, I wrote this book because it's not playtime. It's serious.
Exactly.
Like, all this stuff. It was kidding. And I think part of the reason we're able to talk about it more is just the kind of good side is maybe people are getting more brave. The downside is, I think the reason why people are talking about it more is the situation's just gotten more desperate. Like, you can't push it under the rug anymore. And if I can make a plea for your readers to maybe think about purchasing the book, anybody who knows anything about the book business, you are not making me rich through the $3.50 of royalty or whatever I get. But what you do, and it's been fortunate because it has sold well, is it sends a message to publishers that a controversial book like this does have an audience, that people want to read it, and it will encourage other people, publishers, to accept other books in this vein from other people who will have different and maybe even better takes on some of this stuff. And so, that's the kind of special pleading I'll do for folks who are interested in our conversation and want to read more detail.
Yeah. So The Unprotected Class: How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. Jeremy Carl. Jeremy, I really appreciated our conversation, and thanks for letting me challenge and push back. And I liked your answers. And we have one more quick one, read quick one, then we got to go. We're at time. Trader Bear, $5. France prohibits the state from collecting data about race, ethnicity, and religion. U.S. needs to look at this policy. Okay, well, that's probably not a good one to close on, because we have that's a whole conversation.
Big subject and a really interesting conversation with pluses and minuses to doing that. But yeah, interesting point, and obviously France takes a very different view of this than we do.
Yes, Swedish crime rates, etc. Where can people find you, Jeremy?
Yeah, so on X is kind of where I'm most active. It's real Jeremy Carl. Just one word, it's right there. You've got it out there. And then the other big place is I have a Substack, which the vast majority of stuff is free, called The Course of Empire, jeremycarl.substack.com. I'd love it if people subscribe for free. And if you follow me on those two places, you will keep up to date on all of my doings.
Cool. Well, we appreciate it. We'll appreciate you coming on the show and talking to us, and keep your computer on. We'll talk to you in a few minutes. And as always, thanks to Reed for everything he does for the show. We appreciate it. And Jeremy Carl, thanks a lot, man. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Right on. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. This falls under the umbrella of my nonprofit, National Progress Alliance. Your generous donations keep us going and help fuel content like this. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one.